I don't believe that anybody is above the law. On the other hand, I also have a belief that we need to look forward as opposed to looking backwards, 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 looking backwards,
Several serious crimes have been committed. The evidence is public knowledge. The suspects remain at large. Prima facie evidence is evidence that, unless rebutted by the defendant, is sufficient to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt.
Criminal charge, crime of aggression. Suspects: U.S. Commander-in-Chief George W. Bush, Richard Cheney, Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell.
There's sufficient evidence for a prima facie case of criminal aggression against Iraq, committed by individuals at the highest level of government. On June 11, 2010, the treaty establishing the International Criminal Court was amended to add the crime of aggression, defined as the use of armed force in violation of the UN Charter.
The United Nations Charter is part of U.S. law because we have ratified that treaty, and under the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, treaties become the supreme law of the land once the United States ratifies them. The United Nations Charter says that all countries must settle their disputes peacefully, and no country can invade another country militarily unless it has the blessing of the Security Council or unless it's acting in self-defense. Neither of those two things was present before Bush invaded Iraq.
The first time we had criminal trials for the powerful people was after World War II, with the Nuremberg trials and their equivalent in Japan. And there the powerful were, the formerly powerful in Germany and Japan were put on trial, found guilty, and most of them were executed or put in prison for very long sentences.
But then you can look at the numerous crimes that come in the wake as part of a war. I mean, the reason that in Nuremberg war, or as they termed it, aggressive war, was deemed the most serious international crime was that it included with it in itself the accumulation of the whole of all other crimes.
In March 2003, the United Nations Security Council failed to pass a resolution specifically authorizing war. Nevertheless, relying on an extremely legalistic interpretation of earlier resolutions, which they perhaps thought might exonerate them, the Bush administration proceeded with their invasion plans.
And so the Security Council did not approve Bush's attack on Iraq, and Bush was not acting in self-defense. There was no indication that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. There were former weapons inspectors who had said that those weapons have been destroyed during the Gulf War, during the decade of punishing sanctions. And Iraq had not invaded any other country for 12 years since it went into Kuwait. So that was an illegal war under the UN Charter.
Well, starting an unjustified war is a crime, according to Nuremberg. And Bush started 2 wars, neither of which had what's called casus belli. There were no reasons to start wars in Afghanistan and Iraq.
The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated.
The principles that inform the crime of aggression were announced at Nuremberg, principles which must apply to all countries, including the United States. As Prosecutor Jackson declared, And yet, today, none of the high government officials responsible for committing the crime of aggression by launching an illegal war have been prosecuted. Here's why. By not ratifying the treaty creating the International Criminal Court, the U.S. government immunized itself from prosecution. The ICC, headquartered in the Netherlands, was established by a treaty known as the Rome Statute, which was adopted in 1998. And in 2000, President Clinton signed the Rome Statute, but he did not submit it for Senate ratification, citing fears of politically motivated indictments of U.S. servicemen. Then, in 2002, while planning the invasion of Iraq, the Bush administration withdrew Clinton's signature from the Rome Statute, so that the treaty remains unsigned and unratified. A treaty that is not ratified is not legally binding. So while the United States technically may not be prosecutable today in the ICC for the crime of aggression, its failure to submit to the jurisdiction of the court represents a form of moral hypocrisy and a cynical disregard for the rule of law. Nevertheless, although they may be immune from prosecution under the ICC, Bush and other high officials could still be prosecuted in a foreign court or in a U.S. court for the ordinary crime of criminal homicide.
This study has found that you, Madam Secretary, made 56 false statements to the American people, where you repeatedly pump up the case that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and exaggerate the so-called relationship between Iraq and Al-Qaeda. Madam Secretary, can you please tell us, isn't it true that you had intelligence that cast doubt on your repeated claims that Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction?
No, it's not true, Congressman. With all due respect, I think if you look back at the key judgments of the intelligence estimate about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, you will see that those judgments supported the views of many intelligence agencies worldwide, the views of the United Nations inspectors, that Iraq must have been hiding something.
Criminal charge, conspiracy to defraud Congress. Suspects, George W. Bush, Richard Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell.
The Iraqi regime possesses biological and chemical weapons.
Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. There is no doubt that he is amassing them to use against our friends, against our allies, and against us.
The United States knows that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction.
We don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud.
Documents leaked to the London Times in 2005, known as the Downing Street memos, reveal that the Bush administration had already planned a military attack on Iraq and was manipulating intelligence to justify it.
Official memos, official documents, previously secret memos from 2003, 2002, from within the British government, and in particular the minutes of a meeting that had occurred back in 2002 with all of the top cabinet officials and Prime Minister Tony Blair, and in particular the head of British intelligence, Sir Richard Dearlove, who was just back from Washington, had met at CIA headquarters in Langley, spent 90 minutes with George Tenet, the head of the CIA, and was telling Tony Blair and the British cabinet that the United States was intent on going to war, was fixing the facts around the policy, that is, was distorting the information to make a case for going to war, and the minutes discussed the fact that the United States had effectively already begun, was putting in troops, had escalated bombings in Iraq, and that the war was a done deal, regardless of what legal justification was ever established.
Many of the false claims about Iraq's chemical weapons and its ties to Al-Qaeda came from this man, Ibn Sheikh al-Libi, a Libyan who was captured in Afghanistan and sent by the CIA to Egypt, where he was tortured.
Al-Libi was captured after the US-led invasion of Afghanistan in October 2001. Captured, I believe, in December 2001. He was then interrogated by the FBI non-coercively. The FBI was beginning to get constructive and reliable information from him, and then the CIA took over on the basis that humane questioning was not the way that they wanted to operate in the war on terror that had been declared by the Bush administration. They decided that what they wanted to do with Al-Libi was to render him to another country, in this case Egypt, where he would be tortured by Egyptian interrogators trained in the use of torture on behalf of the United States. So Al-Libi was bundled up apparently into a very small box. As he was put in this small box and loaded onto the plane, and Al-Libi was sent to Egypt, where the professional torturers of the Mubarak regime duly tortured Al-Libi, and he produced false confessions. And the most notorious of these false confessions is that he told his interrogators that operatives from Al-Qaeda had been meeting with Saddam Hussein to discuss the use of chemical and biological weapons. Now, this was a complete lie, produced under the use of torture. I believe that he was waterboarded by the Egyptians, a form of an ancient torture technique that involves controlled drowning. And he retracted his confession, but that information was kept from people within the Bush administration who needed to know. Now, I don't mean that this was kept from President Bush or Dick Cheney. I'm sure Dick Cheney had no interest in whether the information was true or false. He knew that he could use it as part of his plans for the invasion of Iraq. Where it did end up was with Colin Powell, the Secretary of State, who notoriously used that piece of information when he went to the UN Security Council a month before the invasion of Iraq to tell them a whole load of reasons why the invasion was so important.
We know what the fermenters look like. We know what the tanks, pumps, compressors, and other parts look like. We know how they fit together. We know how they work.
And one key element of that speech was this false claim produced under torture by Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi about the chemical and biological weapons and this completely fictional arrangement between Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein.
Criminal charge: conspiracy to commit torture. Suspects: George W. Bush, Richard Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, John Yoo.
This government does not torture people.
If you ask people in general people, how many people do they think were waterboarded by the Department of Defense?
They would make it sound like thousands.
Yeah. The answer is zero.
I don't think we should just roll over when the new administration accuses us of committing torture, which we did not, or somehow violating the law, which we did not.
And the best information we can get is from people we take off the battlefield so we can act on it, so we can stop plots before they happen. And whatever we have done is legal. That's what I'm saying. It's in the law. We had lawyers look at it and say, Mr. President, this is lawful. That's all I can tell you.
In the wake of the attack on Afghanistan in 2001, hundreds of individuals, some as young as 13, were captured on the battlefield and transported to a U.S. military base on the island of Cuba, Guantanamo. Outside U.S. territory, these men were beyond the reach of American law. Blindfolded and shackled, they were accused of being terrorists and held without the right to a proper trial. They were deprived of sleep, subjected to extreme temperatures, loud music, and worse. 8 are known to have died in captivity. Other suspected terrorists were rounded up and abducted by the CIA to black sites in various countries where they were subjected to even harsher treatment, including waterboarding.
The Convention Against Torture, the Geneva Conventions, they all are very clear about the prohibitions against torture. Even in times of war, torture is impermissible and needs to, one, be prosecuted so that it's clear that that type of behavior can never happen again, that type of abuse should never happen again, and not just prohibit it, but also prosecute it.
It has often been claimed that the Geneva Conventions don't apply to Al-Qaeda, that they were not uniformed members of an armed force of a nation. Well, that's not the complete story. There is within the Geneva Conventions common Article 3 that says that no person may be subjected to cruel and inhumane punishment, detention, torture, and the like. Any person that comes into the custody and control of the United States or any party to the Geneva Conventions in a wartime or civil strife situation is protected by the Geneva Conventions, and the United States Supreme Court in the Hamdan case held that specifically. So there is no safe haven for anyone within the Bush administration to suggest that the Geneva Conventions are not fully applicable in this situation.
Now, the Convention Against Torture says that no exceptional circumstances whatsoever, including a state of war, can ever be used as a justification for torture. Nevertheless, the officials, the high officials in the Bush administration, together with their legal mercenaries, John Yoo, Jay Bybee, and others, created a policy, a program of torture, and including waterboarding, which the United States has long considered to be torture, and unknown numbers of men and women have been tortured and subjected to cruel treatment, all illegal, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, at Guantanamo, and in the CIA black sites.
Can I be honest with you? I am bad news. I'm not your friend. I'm not going to help you. I'm going to break you. Any questions?
The biggest story that's come out of Hollywood has been Zero Dark 30, Catherine Bigelow's film, which traces the tracking down and killing of Osama bin Laden. And in that film, very specifically, it plays this role whereby, torture was a necessary part of what took place. That torture played an important part in identifying the location of bin Laden so that he could be tracked down and killed. All of which is, fundamentally and dangerously irresponsible because it's simply not true.
I think it's just a misconception that a misunderstanding that these techniques actually produce valuable evidence. In fact, there's a mountain of evidence that it produces intelligence that can't be relied upon. That people lie just to get them to stop doing these things to them. That there's no way to know what these people are saying is something that is true or whether it's something that they were saying just to get them to stop the abuse.
Professional interrogators will always tell you that if you want reliable information, the only way to do it is to establish a rapport with the person that you're interrogating. And, you have a number of psychological tricks that you can use. But essentially, you're confronted with somebody who is deprived of their liberty. They're not going anywhere. And, you can find a way in which you can get those people to speak. It's not rocket science. It's not an impossibility. Now, in the war on terror, the handful of terrorists identified by the United States have been built up as some kind of supermen figures, impervious to any of these kind of human weaknesses and frailties that have traditionally and effectively been exploited by professional interrogators for ages. So, it was, for whatever reasons, it was the intent of the Bush administration to torture people, even though that was wrong and illegal. And they went through their processes of making sure that would happen. And so, for example, getting lawyers to write memos at a very high level claiming that torture wasn't torture, as happened.
One of the most nefarious characters in this sad tale is a lawyer named John Yoo, who was in the Office of Legal Counsel. His duty was to provide independent, honest advice to the president regarding applicable laws. Early in the Bush administration, John Yoo was tasked with examining the question of torture, what constituted torture, at the request of the CIA, which wanted to engage in what they called enhanced interrogation techniques. They were actually listing the techniques that they wanted to use on detainees. Detainees had begun to be captured in late 2001 and early 2002. The Guantanamo Bay prison was opened in Cuba for that very purpose. And so the list of possible interrogation techniques, including waterboarding, were submitted to the Justice Department and eventually to John Yoo.
So 2 torture memos were written by John Yoo in 2002 saying that torture wasn't torture and then authorizing its use on the first alleged high-value detainee captured in the War on Terror, a man called Abu Zubaydah.
And we now have some of those memos. Not all of the memos have ever been released. And what we see, from my standpoint, is legal malpractice. Memos written with a result in mind, which was to authorize and ratify and approve those techniques. What John Yoo did was to write memos that were entirely result-oriented. The result was to pre-approve the techniques that the CIA wanted to use on detainees.
Getting hammered this morning.
We're down by between 3 and 4.5% generally across these markets. Let's talk about the speed with which we are watching this market deteriorate. We're red everywhere, essentially, down by 4-5%.
We're down over 16%. Dow at the same time has fallen about 18%.
Weary of wars and alarmed by a collapsing economy, the American electorate pinned its hopes on a man who had promised to bring change to Washington.
I would like to see us in a world without fear.
Basically, I just want the war to end. I would like the rest of the world to think highly of our amazing country. I think the thing that inspires me most about Barack Obama is that he really is going to be the president of the United States. You know, he's not going to be the president of the top 10% or the president of the most powerful corporations or the president of the most powerful lobbyists. He's going to be our president. He's going to speak for us because we put him there.
Obama. That's what Obama's about. Unity to this country and changing America's face to the world.
Obama. Obama.
It's a new world after tonight. We get to escape 8 years of depravity and regain our place in the world. People are so hungry for it, you know? That's it.
There are a number of different things that you could do early pertaining to executive orders. Right. One of them is to shut down Guantanamo Bay. Mm-hmm. Another is to change interrogation methods that are used by U.S. troops. Are those things that you plan to take early action on?
Yes. I have said repeatedly that I intend to close Guantanamo, and I will follow through on that. I've said repeatedly that America doesn't torture, and I'm going to make sure that we don't torture. Those are part and parcel of an effort to regain America's moral stature in the world.
Are you prepared to take the oath, Senator?
I am.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
That I will execute the office of President to the United States faithfully.
That I will execute
faithfully the office of President of the United States.
The office of President of the United States faithfully.
And will, to the best of my ability.
And will, to the best of my ability.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
In keeping with his promise for a more open government, the new president had a website created to respond to questions from the public. In January 2009, over 70,000 questions from the public were sent to the Obama transition team. The top-ranked question was this: will you appoint a special prosecutor to independently investigate the gravest crimes of the Bush administration, including torture and warrantless wiretapping? But while members of the public were asking whether anybody from the previous administration would be held to account, pundits and politicians weighed in on the subject.
This whole thing about punishing people in past administrations reminds me more of a banana republic than the United States of America. We don't criminally prosecute people we disagree with when we change office.
We set that kind of precedent. We're no better than a banana republic.
That we somehow criminalize our political system. I mean, you know, in banana republics, one group throws out the other group and they put them all in jail, and then they stay there till somebody else comes along and throws them in jail.
I don't see this as a legal issue. I see this as a policy issue. And for the Congress in the United States, I don't think we need years of distraction trying to find scapegoats or alleged criminal activity.
The question from the Open Government website remained unanswered.
And obviously we're going to be looking at past practices. I don't believe that anybody is above the law. On the other hand, I also have a belief that we need to look forward as opposed to looking backwards.
They're 1 o'clock. Haven't seen anything since then.
Just fucking, once you get on, just open them up.
Okay, Roger. I see your element. You got about 4 Humvees out along this.
You're clear.
All right, firing. What's the baseline? Let me know when you have